41st Regiment and its 3 battalions, commanded by Colonel Yazawa Kiyoshi, would land in Papua and rush forward to support the advance. Unlike the Australians, both Japanese regiments were well supported with medium to heavy machine guns, mortars, and mountain artillery. Horii's plan was for Tsukamoto and Kawada's battalions to take Isurava, supported with combat engineers, dismounted cavalry, and mortars and mountain guns. Tsukamoto's battalion would attack, advancing down Kokoda Track, while Kawada's battalion would attempt a western flanking manoeuvre along the high ground just west of Isurava. Further east, along Misima Ridge, Horii's battalion also conducted a flanking movement, but his objective was to capture Alola, placing him behind the Australians dug in at Isurava. General Horii finally launched his attack on the 26th of August. Just 2 days later, the 28th of August, acknowledging the difficulties at Guadalcanal and the disaster at Milne Bay, the Imperial headquarters in Tokyo, while ordering Horii to continue his advance, ordered him not to attack Port Moresby. Rather, he was to take up a defensive position just north and await orders for a renewal of the offensive. Horii would not receive these orders until mid-September, and he would select Ioribaiwa Ridge as his base for future operations against the township. As planned, Tsukamoto and Kawada attacked the Australians' militiamen at Isurava, who were now led by their CO, Lieutenant Colonel Ralph Honor, who had arrived at Isurava a week before. Meanwhile, Horii was developing his flanking manoeuvre to the east, pushing back the ill-equipped and poorly trained militiamen of the 53rd Battalion, who had arrived just days earlier to defend Alola and the eastern and western tracks that converged at the village. To lose Alola would mean Honor and his men at Isurava would be completely cut off and surrounded. Luckily for Honor and his men, the veterans of the Australian 21st Brigade, led by Brigadier Arnold Potts, were now advancing along the track to reinforce Honor. These men of the 2nd Australian Imperial Force, 2nd AIF, had fought with great distinction in Syria and had arrived back in Australia months before. The battle-hardened veterans of the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th Battalions were now being pushed up the Kokoda Track. The first men of the 2nd 14th Battalion arrived at Isurava on the afternoon of the day that Horii launched his attack. The men of the 2nd 16th Battalion arrived soon after at Alola, taking over its defence from the militiamen of the 53rd Battalion, who were soon after ordered back to Port Moresby, as they were considered more of a hindrance, and Potts needed to relieve his supply situation. Potts and Honor's men suffered heavily after a week of constant combat and were forced to conduct a fighting withdrawal down the track. A major problem was the lack of supplies. The Australians were fighting well forward of their main supply base, while the Japanese at this point were still close to their supplies built up at Kokoda. It was now that Potts finally got the welcomed news that his remaining unit, the 2nd 27th Battalion, was moving up the track to reinforce his depleted battalions. Many of his men from the 2nd 14th and 2nd 16th Battalions, along with some from the 39th Battalion, were missing from the fighting in and around Isurava and Alola, lost in the jungle and cloud-covered ridges and valleys of the Owen Stanleys, blindly pushing south to hopefully contact the brigade. Many of these men would never be seen again, including the commander of the 2nd 14th Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Key. With the arrival of the 2nd 27th Battalion, Honor and his men were finally relieved and ordered down the line to regroup and re-equip, having fought the Japanese alone for over a month, and in doing so, suffered around 50% casualties. Traditionally, losses approaching 10% are considered a bloodbath. At this point, Horii was determined to outflank, surround, and finally destroy the Australian force, thought to be taking up a position around Templeton's Crossing and Myola. Horii was now reinforced with the arrival in the forward area of 2 battalions of the 41st Regiment. Major Koiwai Mitsuo and his men of the 2nd 41st Regiment, and Major Kobayashi Asuo and his men of the 3rd 41st Regiment.